Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a quick fire video. This has just recently come to my attention. The British Army's guide for spotting extreme right-wing soldiers has leaked online. It is worth noting that this is not a project which has gone live. However, this was leaked early. This did come across my social media about a week ago, but I thought it was a hoax. I thought this was basically a 4chan prank. But I should have known better. It's so insane, and I cannot believe it's true. But basically, the army has released, or not released, but the Ministry of Defence has confirmed this is real. Basically, it's a checklist for extreme right-wing indicators and warnings of what to look out for. But I guarantee there's not one for the extreme left-wing. Wouldn't surprise me. There's nothing there which is going to have a set of check boxes saying describes themselves as anti-fascist, describes themselves as communist or socialist, describes themselves as looking to abolish the rich and stuff like that. I bet that's not going to come forward. But this, the extreme right wing. Now, I've looked at this over. In fact, I tried to make this video once before, but decided that after the 20 minutes that it took to record, that it recorded no audio. So I'm going to do this again. As you can see from the first box, which is the most egregious box in this entire checklist, if you can't tell, I am very, very angry at this. Describes themselves as patriots. Describes themselves as patriots. If you're a patriot and you describe yourself as such, and you're in the armed forces because for whatever reason you might end up being in the armed forces as a patriot, you're apparently an indication that you have extreme right-wing views. Absolutely disgusting, absolutely disgraceful. The idea that you can demonise people who love their country so much so that they want to defend it, that want to potentially give their lives for it, are willing to take a bullet, and to do, like, people don't understand this. If you kill someone in a theatre of war, it does horrible things to your brain, does horrible things to your mind. Right? It's something which, there's a reason soldiers don't talk about the number of people they've killed, right? Because it's a horrible experience. It is something which no person should have to do to another, but it's something that, for the defence of our nation, for the most part, when it's not in a proxy war propped up by our government, when it's for the defence of our nation, it's something which the sacrifice of the few for the many has to happen. And with the state of our armed forces, with the condition of the living, with the decreasing value of the pension, with the ever-imposing, like 2021, all the housing situation for subsidised housing is going to change because the contract which was signed in 1996 is going to come to an end. If you are the only people who are joining in the military and staying more than the 4 years minimum term service are patriots or careeros who have absolutely no love for this country, but are usually direct entrant officers with a university background looking to get into the MOD gravy train. The patriotism aspect is so key to the military identity, and the idea that this would be an indicator of an extreme right-wing view is absolutely disgraceful. Secondly, we have here, look at opponents as traitors. It's like, I wonder what this is in relation to. I would imagine that it's something to do with the fact that certain attitudes to our government, for the places in which they've been sending our soldiers, for the lawsuits that have been brought against our soldiers in previous theatres of war, and for the continuing attitude of belligerence when it comes to ignoring the will of the people for Brexit. I would completely understand why some people would call their opponents traitors to the nation, right? Because they are selling out the country to an international body, right? Something which is the definition of traitor, and they're not doing well. And then when it comes to, like, I don't know, like I'm trying to think of when it comes to the military, what people might describe as a traitor to in the military side of things, when it comes to something like, I don't know, letting Shamima Begum or like someone who's defected to ISIS back into the country and considering those people and the people who let them in to be traitors, that is not an extreme right-wing view. It's a pretty wide-held view amongst most people. Looking at opponents as traitors, I could understand if you said race traitors, right? Because that brings the racial element into it, which is obviously more of a moniker of the extreme right wing. But just general traitorship, it might be a bit dramatic, but it's not an indicator that someone's insanely right wing. Thirdly, we have refer to individuals ready to challenge their extreme right-wing views as being indoctrinated. Well, let's see here now. In our state-controlled education system and in our incredible, I think the latest statistics was 20-1 left-wingers versus right-wingers in university system, and when those people come with their extreme left-wing views, which you're clearly not picking up here, or in their left-wing views in general, things like redistribution of wealth, eradicating the rich, Antifa and stuff like that, as being indoctrinated, when you present them with facts and it's clear that they've had absolutely no education which has led them to think for themselves, when you can tell exactly what someone is going to say just by the institution they've come from, that is indoctrination, and challenging their extreme right-wing views. With what? With loud noise, with deplatforming, with a refusal to debate and talk about difficult issues. That is the definition of indoctrination, because if you thought for yourself, you'd want to expose yourself to difficult points of view so that you could confirm that your own views were correct. Fourthly, refer to political correctness as some left-wing or communist plot. Again, political correctness comes almost exclusively from the university educated, where there is an extreme left-wing bias. Political correctness is often cited as a reason for, denunciation in the media, which again is dominated by the left wing. As for the communists, they have been using identity politics and political correctness to legitimize their own ideas in the public sphere for years. Not that it's something exclusive to the left wing, it's something which the right wing used to have in the 80s and 90s. You look at things like video game violence and that sort of thing. In fact, you look at film censorship and that sort of thing, that was traditional conservatives typically calling for that, and you could describe them as relatively right wing. But it's never been a moniker for the extreme right wing, and I just find it insane. Use blatantly untruthful or incorrect references to immigrants, Judaism, or Islam. Now, are you going to have a list of these blatantly untruthful or incorrect references, or is it going to be based off of the perception of the person involved? Because that it's in itself needs to be done. Like the military works on procedure, it works on having lists of things, and if you don't tick into the right box, it's quite bureaucratical. If you don't tick into the right box, you don't get the prize. So you're going to have a list of these references, because there are certain things about immigration which certainly would be considered not politically correct, but a hate fact, and it's still a fact whether or not you hate it or not. Adding Istan to British place names like Londonistan or whatever, and you're just going, yeah, it's a meme, right? And it refers to the fact that multiculturalism has pushed out traditionally British people from London, and London is not a traditionally British city anymore. Proud of its multicultural nature, as a right to be, until it collapses in on itself, because I believe that the multiculturalism experiment is failing. But it's typically just like, the expansion of Islam is undeniable in this country. There's still a small percentage of the country, but their expansion into cities in particular is not in dispute. Next we have the term Islamofascism. I actually agree with them here. I don't know anyone really in kind of more moderate circles who uses the term Islamofascism itself. But it's weird that it has its own box when there's also the box for blatantly untruthful or incorrect references, etc. Maybe they just had to fill 20 boxes, Make generalizations about Muslims and Jews. Oh my god. Like, the military is built on banter. And part of that banter is making fun of individuals for all sorts of things that are intrinsic to that individual, and making fun of groups based on stereotypes. It is part of the military culture. It is one of the reasons why nobody cares who you are when you're in the military. What they care about is what you've done, what your work is. I say that that's the ethos of the military, but clearly it's not their ethos. Making generalizations about Muslims and Jews. Right? Typically, it's a joke. But obviously, like, if you're talking about direct action and that sort of thing, then obviously I have a problem with that. But next, make inaccurate generalizations about the left or the government. Again, you're going to have to write down a list of what's an inaccurate generalization, but you can't define that, can you? Because the left is too broad a group, and the government is clear policy decisions and is making clear steps. Like, they make statements, everything that they do is recorded. So inaccurate generalizations, you're going to have to be more specific, man. Talk of an impending racial conflict or race war. Yeah, sure, I can agree with that one. Describe multicultural towns as lost. Well, as I mentioned earlier, the multicultural experiment has failed in this country because what it is, in effect, is a kind of reverse colonialism. It's a kind of, you sit here in your segregated group, you make absolutely no effort whatsoever to take any lessons from the groups around you, and especially if you're a foreign group, we wouldn't want to impose British cultural values upon you. We want to preserve you as you are, but of course then those groups spread, especially when they come from cultures with a much higher birth rate, for instance, and then they slowly spread and they go around, which is why certain towns in the north of England in particular are almost unrecognisable as British towns, and the same in London. London itself has small pockets of Englishness, but for the most part it's incredibly multicultural, and the British element has been lost. Discuss the creation of white-only communities. Yeah, I would agree with this one. So that's actually 3 I agree with on this list so far. We're only 12 in. Claim that immigration is is the root of injustices against vulnerable people. Well, immigration per se is the root of injustices against vulnerable people in a certain context, which is not that immigration as a concept is a bad thing. I don't think anyone, apart from, yes, really extreme right-wing people, are claiming that immigration itself is so bad that we need to shut the borders completely and have zero net immigration per year. The ability to move between countries is not something which is controversial, but the sheer numbers of immigration, we are at the level of 300,000 net per year. This is immigration which is unprecedented through all of British history. And as we can see in other nations across Europe, Germany and Sweden in particular, where they've had mass immigration to a much higher degree than we have, it causes an enormous cultural clash. And who are the primary victims of cultural clashes? It's vulnerable people. Old age pensioners who are fleeing towns primarily in the north and in parts of Wales so that they can get away because they do not feel safe. It's children, as we've seen with the grooming gang scandals, and it's veterans and indeed the unemployed, as is not mentioned here, because immigration at such a high level drives down wages. It is clear, it is demonstrable that high net immigration has a negative consequence. And when it comes to things like the statistics which the kinds of people who write this legislation come out with, they say, oh, immigrants are a net positive to our economy. They contribute X amount, X billion per year. It's not true, is it? Because it's Western European immigrants who provide that to you. Eastern European immigrants are about neutral. And from anywhere else in the world who we have a high net immigration from, places like India, places like Sudan, places like Pakistan, and indeed any of the refugee cases we have, they are a net loss to the economy, and overall the statistics demonstrably show it's a net loss overall. Next we have threatening violence when losing an argument, although claiming that the extreme right-wing groups protest peacefully. Oh, we don't threaten violence typically, so when losing an argument. I think this is actually a behaviour which is far more prevalent on the extreme left wing, although they don't threaten violence, they just commit it. Antifa groups smacking people with bike locks, milkshaking political candidates. Then you get the idea that Antifa come and they'll say, oh, it's not your time, it's your time soon, we're going to kill you, basically. These sorts of groups exist, but the extreme right-wing groups are so small, are so marginal, that these sorts of things are just, it's irrelevant. The majority of right-wing protests are peaceful, and the only violence which arises is when they get attacked by the left wing. They don't go out and assault random people in the street on the basis of, I don't know, the colour of their skin or whatever. People turn up with like baseball bats and sticks and stuff and want to hit people, and they have force to have self-defense. You see this exact same thing when it came to the Tommy Robinson, which is no doubt what the army would consider to be an extreme right-wing thing, especially considering the controversy which happened when he had a photo taken with a particular regiment, can't remember the exact one now. All of the violence in that particular protest with Tommy Robinson came from the Islamic Defence League, like a strongly conservative group, but they wouldn't exactly define them as extreme right-wing now, would they? Because that would conflict with your blatantly untruthful or incorrect references to Islam and make generalizations about Muslims and Jews. They would conflict with those. Claim that it is acceptable to abuse Jews or Muslims, as Judaism or Islam are not races. No one is claiming that it is acceptable to abuse Jews or Muslims. What we say is it is appropriate to criticize Judaism or Islam on the basis of the fact that they are ideological idea structures, they are lifestyles based upon principles, on ideas, and on values, and those things are certainly up to be talked about, or they should be, because at the moment they're not. Have tattoos with overt and covert extreme right-wing iconography. Now I wonder what the range of tattoos that you're talking about here extends to, and I wonder why it doesn't extend to things like the hammer and sickle, right? So if it's someone who's got like a swastika on them or so on and so forth, and they haven't covered it up and so on and so forth, like, I can understand that. I think that is explicit. That's extreme right wing. It's too much, you know. But if it's a Pepe head that someone got tattooed on their ass as a joke on a night out because they happen to like memes, then no, absolutely not. Become increasingly angry at perceived injustices or threats to so-called national identity. Well, as we've talked about previously on 2 of these other slides, national identity is under risk by the multicultural agenda. It's by the multiculturalism experiment, and as we've seen in all the areas which have embraced multiculturalism, the British national identity is shunted to the back, because God forbid the idea that the British national identity should have pride of place in a British town above the cultures of other people who wish to integrate into it. And if they don't wish to integrate in it, then they can get out. But as there are protected characteristics and protected groups, and British identity is not one of them, these groups are unfairly using their advantage to push themselves into an ever-increasing position of power and erode the national identity. Involve colleagues in closed social media groups, I presume for the purposes of humour and edgy jokes, because like no one has come, like the only groups which have been exposed have been people with like a really edgy sense of humour. Not all of it I agree with, but all of it is intended to be humour for the most part. And so you don't really see closed WhatsApp groups being exposed as something, you know, like, oh, we're gonna kill the black people, you know, and that sort of thing. Doesn't happen. What gets exposed is people making edgy jokes because they have edgy humour, and then getting told that they're racists for having that kind of humour. Actively seek out impressionable individuals to indoctrinate or recruit. Oh no, they're not a university, so unfortunately they're not indoctrinating them here. I just do not see this as indoctrination or recruiting. Most of the people who get called extreme right-wing when they're not extreme right-wing simply want people to think for themselves and will direct people to sources and ask them to make up their own mind. And finally, the only other one I agree with on this list, which is have extreme right-wing group stickers or badges on clothing and personal items. I would agree with that. If you have a swastika or a hammer and sickle on your clothing, then that's a bad idea. However, if this extends to things like the Kekistani flag or Pepe heads, which is a complete meme and absolutely nothing to do with racism, then absolutely I disagree. So let me know what you think about this in the comments, and if you can, have a great week. Take care.